Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and it's time to wrap up week 90 with Silmarillion Saturday. These Saturdays are our chance to revisit the history and legends of the Elder Days, from the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or something else altogether. Now, last week, since we're covering the story of Túrin is coming to Gondolin on First Stage Fridays, I began to look at other material in the Silmarillion connected to his time there, starting with the chapter of Maeglin. Now, we've got a few more weeks here before we go on to Of the Ruin of Beleriand and the Fall of Fingolfin, which will complete next series. Now, last week, we met Aredhel, sister of Turgon, and joined her on her journey to find Celegorm and Curufin, with our reading ending right as she was enmeshed in Nan Elmoth. Now, before I begin, I need to provide a trigger warning, really. Today's episode is going to confront a question about sexual violence, or at the very least, coerced consent. There is no glossing this over, so I'm just going to read the passage and do my best to talk about it. The text continues after Aredhel's becoming enmeshed in Nan Elmoth. In that wood in ages past, Melian walked in the twilight of Middle-earth when the trees were young, and enchantment lay upon it still. But now the trees of Nan Elmoth were the tallest and darkest in all Beleriand, and there the sun never came, and there Eol dwelt, who was named the Dark Elf. Of old he was of the kin of Thingol, but he was restless and ill at ease in Doriath. And when the girdle of Melian was set about the forest of Region, where he dwelt, he fled thence to Nan Elmoth. There he lived in deep shadow, loving the night and the twilight under the stars. He shunned the Noldor, holding them to blame for the return of Morgoth, to trouble the quiet of Beleriand. But for the dwarves he had more liking than any other of the elven folk of old. From him the dwarves learned much of what passed in the lands of the Eldar. Now the traffic of the dwarves down from the Blue Mountains followed two roads across East Beleriand, and the northern way, going towards the fords of Aros, passed nigh to Nan Elmoth, and there Eol would meet the Naugrim and hold converse with them. And as their friendship grew, he would at times go and dwell as guest in the deep mansions of Nogrod or Belagost. There he learned much of metalwork, and came to great skill therein. And he devised a metal as hard as the steel of the dwarves, but so malleable that he could make it thin and supple, and yet it remained resistant to all blades and darts. He named it Galvorn, for it was black and shining like jet, and he was clad in it whenever he went abroad. But Eol, though stooped by his smithwork, was no dwarf, but a tall elf of a high kin of the Teleri, noble though grim of face, and his eyes could see deep into shadows and dark places. And it came to pass that he saw Aredhel Arfaniel as she strayed among the tall trees near the borders of Nan Elmoth, a gleam of white in the dim land. Very fair she seemed to him, and he desired her, and he set his enchantments about her so that she could not find the ways out, but drew ever nearer to his dwelling in the depths of the wood. There were his smithy and his dim halls, and such servants as he had, silent and secret as their master. And when Aredhel, weary with wandering, came at last to his doors, he revealed himself, and he welcomed her, and led her into his house. And there she remained, for Eol took her to wife, and it was long ere any of her kin heard of her again. It is not said that Aredhel was wholly unwilling, nor that her life in Nan Elmoth was hateful to her for many years. For though at Eol's command she must shun the sunlight, they wandered far together under the stars, or by the light of the sickle moon. Or she might fare alone as she would, save that Eol forbade her to seek the sons of Feanor, or any others of the Noldor. And Aredhel bore to Eol a son in the shadows of Nan Elmoth, and in her heart she gave him a name in the forbidden tongue of the Noldor, Lomion, that signifies child of the twilight. But his father gave him no name until he was 12 years old. Then he called him Maeglin, which is sharp glance, for he perceived that the eyes of his son were more piercing than his own, and his thought could read the secrets of hearts beyond the mist of words. As Maeglin grew to full stature, he resembled in face and form rather his kindred of the Noldor, but in mood and mind he was the son of his father. His words were few, save in matters that touched him near, and then his voice had a power to move those that heard him and to overthrow those that withstood him. He was tall and black-haired. His eyes were dark, yet bright and keen as the eyes of the Noldor, and his skin was white. Often he went with Eöl to the cities of the dwarves in the east of Eredlindon, and there he learned eagerly what they would teach, and above all, the craft of finding the ores of metals in the mountains. So the reading begins with some background on Eöl, of the kin of Thingol, but fleeing to this forest outside the girdle of Melian, hating the Noldor, blaming them for Morgoth, good relations with the dwarves. Now, in an older version, we read something very interesting. He had great smithcraft, especially in the making of swords, in which work he surpassed even the Noldor of Aman. And many therefore believed that he used the Morgul, the black arts taught by Morgoth. And if you think that's bad, just wait. Now, the published version is already deeply disturbing. Eöl using magic to prevent Aredhel's escape from his forest, drawing her in only when she was weary and then taking her to wife. There's already a very strong implication here, but if we look at that same early version of the story, it's much worse. There he is said to have found her astray in the wild near his dwelling, and he took her to wife by force, a very wicked deed in the eyes of the Eldar. Now, let's be clear what that means, right? Marriage among the Eldar is only marriage when sex is involved. You have sex, you're married. And that's why you only marry one person forever. I mean, that's how it works. So he did this by force. Now, I've not had a chance to look at when this story was written versus when Tolkien wrote Laws and Customs of the Eldar, which is found in Morgoth's Ring, but this idea of him taking her to wife by force does seem to run very counter to something there, where Tolkien writes, "There is no record of any among the elves that took another's spouse by force, for this was wholly against their nature, and one so forced would have rejected bodily life and passed to Mandos." Now, look, I know I can hear some of you saying, Aredhel wasn't anybody's spouse, so this doesn't apply, but come on. That really, really misses the broader point. Aredhel could have, or perhaps even would have, rejected bodily life and passed to Mandos. On another note, can I just ask, why should the victim have to do that? Can't Mandos just push a button and immediately summon the perpetrator to the halls for like a very long time? Anyway, this whole idea of how this might conflict with her giving up life might be the reason, we don't know for sure, but it might be the reason that Tolkien tried to soften the story. But in softening it a bit, we get what I referred to last week as one of the most troubling lines in Tolkien. It is not said that Aredhel was wholly unwilling. Can we be entirely clear about this and say that means she was at least partially unwilling? Which is unwilling, plain and simple. Any consent was manufactured and the direct result of coercion. What was in that earlier version a physical rape by any definition is now just as much the same exact wicked deed. It's that now it's more psychological in nature. Implied threats, mental manipulation, coercion, and control from this moment until she flees. Now, I know this topic requires a lot more than just a few-minute discussion. I know I haven't done it justice. So you can go all the way back to episode 26 in the first season of the PPP for a bit more. To be honest, though, Sean and I have never been satisfied with our discussion back then. We always have talked about that as one of those things that we really wished we'd done more on. And I do plan that when I revisit the Silmarillion for a couple of years on the show, not this next season, but the one after, we can tackle this subject even more thoroughly and openly. Folks, that does it for this week's Silmarillion Saturday. Thank you for joining me. Please come back next week as Maeglin grows up and Aredhel flees Nan Elmoth. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can get an ad-free feed, bonus episodes, and become a part of my content council to help decide what I'll talk about next series. Podcast listeners, be sure to subscribe to the show in your podcast apps. For those on YouTube, subscribe to the channel to get all of the PPP productions, and be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.